Lessig. How many people here have read something that he's written? Read one of his books? A lot of you? He really blows my mind, and he's just so insightful. He is the leading authority on intellectual property rights related to the internet, among many other accomplishments. The relevancy, as I see it, for him being here today is the work that he's doing around optimizing the conditions for creativity and collaboration. You know, we think a lot about, we say green, and we immediately go to like the earth and climate change and these things that save the forest, and no kidding, that's all important. And it's also a priori, because if we lose culture in the process, I mean, we lost it all. Right, so we need to like optimize the conditions that also support human beings to live into their creative, fruitful horizons. And he's pivotal to that. And it's so pivotal to the sustainability space that we don't lose art and that we don't lose creativity. And so it's just an enormous privilege for us here to welcome to the stage today Lawrence Lessig.
So some familiar ideas. The idea of an ecology, the idea of an environment, core ideas for what we think of as environmentalism. Environmentalism, the practice of taking apparently unlinked parts, like the air, the water, and the land, and showing how they're linked together, how they go together in a way to produce an environment that must be preserved. When you think about environmentalism, you're likely to think about the physical environment. But more than a decade ago, my colleague and friend Jamie Boyle wrote this extraordinary piece about what we could call cultural environmentalism. He spoke about an ecology for culture that we recognize by seeing the parts of culture and how they're linked, and how when we use or abuse those parts, we weaken the environment for culture. Now, it's useful to think about this cultural environmentalism, not just for cultural environmentalism. It's useful for environmentalists generally. And that's why I'm happy to be here to talk to you environmentalists. Now, a core conceptual tool of this environmentalist movement, of environmentalism, is this extremely boring concept given to us by extremely boring cadre of people called economists, the idea of the externality. And of course, to understand an externality, understand anything, we have to turn to Wikipedia to understand it. So here's Wikipedia's explanation of the idea of an externality. Externality is an impact, positive or negative, on any party not involved in a given economic transaction. So a negative externality, for example, imagine the sound at a rock concert, or the odor from a pig farm, or the carbon produced by polluting plants. These are activities that impose costs on others, others not necessarily involved in the transaction. That's the negative externality. But equally, there's a positive externality. Think, for example, about beekeepers, or kids who suffer vaccination, or artists who produce music. These are people who engage in activities that impose benefits on others, others not necessarily involved in the transaction. It's a positive externality they produce. So externalities are positive and negative. But as The Economist reminds us, externalities cause problems. The problems are that markets ordinarily produce, as The Economist says, an inefficient supply of these externalities. Produces too many negative externalities, too few positive externalities. And so we need to respond to what the market normally would provide. And we respond by internalizing the externality. It's almost erotic the way it sounds, to internalize the externality. So we need to internalize these costs or benefits. So for example, the rock concert might engage in agreements with people around where the rock concert will be held to internalize the negative externality. Or the pig farm might be subject to zoning, or the pollution-producing coal plants might, we could dream, be subject to regulation. These are interventions all to force the producer of negative externalities to internalize their cost. But likewise with positive externalities. The beekeepers engage in agreements with people whose fields they pollinate. Or kids or their parents are subject to regulation to force them to engage in this positive externality producing behavior of vaccinating against certain kinds of diseases. Or the law creates the law of copyright to give authors of great new works the incentives they need to produce those works, the positive externality notwithstanding. These are interventions all to allow the producer of positive externalities to internalize the benefit of their externality. Now, of course, in neither case, with the positive externality or the negative externality, is the intervention necessary in all cases. Sometimes we do fine without any intervention at all. Like when somebody moves out of their house, that moving produces a kind of negative externality for the neighbors, but we don't require a government regulation to regulate every act of moving in or out. We get by. Or many people find it sufficient to be inspired to do, they call this art in Germany, this kind of creative work without being paid by people who walk by and see it to benefit from that. This person's sufficiently incented to produce this wonderful positive externality without regulation. So either because there's enough incentives without the intervention, or because the cost of intervening is greater than the benefit, in either case, the externality need not be dealt with through regulation. The point is, we shouldn't think about externalities as if this is some kind of religion. We should think about it in a practical, sensitive sense, about how to regulate to affect whatever ecology of creativity or production we're trying to regulate. Okay. Now here's the obvious point, right? Ecologies change. The right balance of regulation or non-regulation changes. And technology drives that change. Now that's obvious to everybody here when we think about the environment and we think about things like coal. Less obvious to us when we think about culture. And so I want to make this less obvious part obvious to you. And to do that, I want to tell you a story. And the story begins with Aldous Huxley, 1927. Here's what Huxley wrote. In the days before machinery, men and women who wanted to amuse themselves were